For some time now, many commentators have been speculating on where the global economy was going. Would there be a recession? Would inflation ever return? How can the economy deal with all the debt in the system? Then COVID. It's overshadowed all that discussion, and it's now just how can the world and the markets as we knew it ever return? Welcome to this edition of IG Trading the Markets podcast. To look at where we are and how things may develop, we're joined now by Barry Eichengreen, Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Eichengreen, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast this week. First of all, how has the economy changed in the last 12 weeks? Are we overstating the fact that we are in a situation that no one has ever computed before?
I do not think that's an overstatement. We have never seen a drop in output and employment in the United States and worldwide as fast and as far as what's happened in the last 12 weeks. As we speak today, there are new real-time estimates from one of the Federal Reserve Banks, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta for the U.S. economy, pointing to the fact that real GDP has fallen by more than 50% in the last 12 weeks. So it's fair to say we have never seen something like this before.
What has this done? Because it's a pandemic, it's not of the making of the financial markets like we saw in the great financial crisis 10, 12 years ago. This is something which is a genuine black swan event. How does an economy recover from an event such as this? Is it just a question of repairing over time, or does it require some deep fundamental thinking across geographies in order to get us back to where we want to be?
There are two prerequisites, in my view, for recovery. Number one, we have to control the virus, the pandemic. That makes forecasting even harder than usual, especially for an economist, given the novelty of the virus. It makes forecasting difficult for everyone. I have serious worries about the management of the virus, its public health consequences, its spread in the United States, in Brazil, in the United Kingdom, and a variety of other countries. In the US now, we have this terrible overlay of social conflict, which, among other things, has led a lot of people with valid grievances to mass in the streets. And again, I think that clouds the picture for what the public health scenario will be going forward. Secondly, I think we have to come to terms with the idea that in the same way that we flipped a switch and turned the economy off, we can't simply flip a switch and turn it on. That there are significant segments of the economy that died of asphyxiation, if you will, and they're not going to come back after the virus. That hospitality and tourism and travel will be permanently affected, and we have to begin to think about how we will shift resources from sectors that will have to downsize significantly and permanently to new sectors. What we've done so far has been to try to keep those hotel chains and travel companies alive with subsidies, and we're going to have to think about what those resources will have to be transformed into in the longer run.
You talk about the effects within the Western economies, very open economies. We can very transparent political systems in the West, in both America and of course, in Northern Europe. And we've got used to this. In China, it's a very different situation, the Far East. There's far more political control. We don't know for sure how deep the COVID crisis has affected the population within China because we don't know that much about what's going on. Do you see there to be some sort of material shift that has to be undertaken in the West? In other words, more political control. You talk about the protests that have developed in the States through some other event, but there is to be seen in the West a very liberal political control or lack of control compared to what's happening in China. Do you think that there will have to be a shift in political perception and understanding about how the population is, to a degree, controlled better in order to ensure that we don't get the spread of the virus like we've seen it? In other words, more lockdowns, the political scene impacting itself more on how the economy is run, like we've seen in China and some of the other Far Eastern economies?
No, I would not agree with the idea that we're heading into a world of more political control. What people are demanding in China and in the West is more political responsiveness, that political institutions and leaders respond to their concerns and grievances, whether these are on the public health front or the racial inequality front. There will be, I believe, some rethinking about privacy as well, that there can be trade-offs between privacy on the one hand and contact tracing, for example, on the other. Governments in Europe are grappling with whether information about the health condition of individuals should be centralized in the hands of government, or whether public health can be adequately managed and maintained on a more decentralized basis. I do think that the Chinese government will have to respond to these concerns as well, that there are concerns about whether the political system was sufficiently responsive to the concerns that people raised when the virus was discovered, as opposed to punishing physicians who raised warnings about it. There are very real privacy concerns in China of a different sort than in the West, but there are concerns there as well. So I think the issue will be one of the responsiveness of government. It will be one about the adequacy or inadequacy of social cohesion, that societies that are more cohesive and where people trust their government have done better in terms of managing this crisis. And those are the kind of things people are going to be talking about going forward.
Okay, so assuming that we have to deal with a situation where we have to continue to manage the crisis, as you say, and that COVID just doesn't disappear. With that set up in mind, how do you see the Western economies responding? We hear a lot of discussion about how the recession is going to repair. Is it going to be a V shape? Is it going to be a W shape? Is it going to be a long U shape without any sort of firm direction for a number of years? How do you see the economy is getting back on track? What is the path that we should expect?
The path will be conditioned. It will be shaped by those same public health policies. So if the United States now opens up, the recovery will begin to look like a U or a V or a swoosh. But then if the virus comes back, we're going to have to lock down again. And then it will begin to look like a W or an L. So I apologize for coming back to the same point, but it all depends on the course of the coronavirus. I do think that earlier hopes for a V-shaped recovery, even under optimal first best public health policy, were set up to be disappointed. That the V-shape idea was that, as I said before, we could simply flip a switch and the economy would turn back on. But I do think the economy has been transformed in ways that will require a lengthy and costly process of reallocating resources, what the economist Joseph Schumpeter referred to as creative destruction, where we have to see the destruction of certain old companies and business models, and then a lengthy and difficult process of discovering what will work in the post-coronavirus world.
Along this line of recovery, what happens to inflation? What happens to prices when you get a situation like this? Let's take the idea that we have to manage the virus on a continual basis. Do prices start to rise because supply chains continue to be disrupted? Food remains unharvested in the field and causes shortages and so forth. Is that a situation we should expect and prices rise, or do prices stay at these historic low levels?
In the short run, whatever that means, inflation is likely to stay at its current low level. So the prices of individual commodities where supply chains have been severely impaired, pork and beef are examples that we're talking about at the moment in the United States. Those prices may go up, but the overall inflation rate, I think, will remain low. It will remain subdued because demand is even weaker than supply. households have been reminded of the value of precautionary saving. They're not able to spend on those experiential goods, go to theme parks and on cruises in the way they did before. Firms will be reluctant to invest because they don't know what kind of commercial real estate projects will be viable in a virus-ridden world. For the foreseeable future, again, whatever that means, I think inflation will remain low. But we're also reminded of what the economist Herb Stein said in the 1970s. Stein was the rare economist with a sense of humor. And he said, if something cannot go on forever, it generally will not. So at some point, governments issuing all this debt and engaged in all this deficit spending, financed in large part by central banks, will begin to place upward pressure on prices. I do not think that a modicum of inflation would be a disaster. We've lived with inflation in the mid-single digits and even higher without catastrophic consequences akin to the consequences of this virus throughout history, repeatedly throughout history for extended periods. And that's one way in which government debts relative to GDP are brought down to lower, more sustainable levels. So I think we can say with confidence that that will happen at some point. Inflation will begin to accelerate. Central banks are committed to keeping that inflation from getting out of control. And I think they have the ability to do that as well. But we will see them here and there overshooting modestly their inflation targets, again, without disastrous consequences.
We hear that the whole business of supply chains almost certainly become shorter, and certainly some areas will shorten. Now, this does have an inflationary impact. Do you see this coming about? Do you see all this bringing about shorter supply chains? We're manufacturing closer to home, making sure that we grow the food that we want to eat within a country, and that we continue to find ways of making sure that you don't rely on cross-border imports in order to make sure you maintain a healthy lifestyle.
Absolutely. I think we will see movement in that direction, but I would caution that there is a temptation to overstate its extent. So after 2008, 2009, people confidently predicted that we would clamp down hard on the financial system and we would never see collateralized loan obligations or anything like that again. Well, it didn't happen. We had modest changes in business practice. And I think we will again see limited changes in business practice in the direction of shorter supply chains, reshoring, and so forth. But I would not exaggerate the extent.
I said at the top that pre-COVID, there had already been concerns within the system about a possible recession and inflation and prices and so forth. And one of the things was the amount of debt in the system. That the debt now in the system is absolutely enormous compared to anything we had pre-COVID. How do we deal with this? What happens with that? What effect is this going to have on our recovery and our ability to be able to rebuild the economy of old?
We've been here before. Debts were even higher, for example, in the aftermath of World War II. So these problems can, in principle, be managed. We are creating a legacy which will function as a drag on economic growth. Heavy debts are going to increase the fragility of the financial system. They're going to absorb private savings that could go into other productive forms of investment. But there was no choice. This is what you do in a national emergency. This is what governments do when wars break out. It's what they have to do when pandemics that pose a threat to the survival of a significant fraction of their population break out. So I do think that we run the risk. There is the possibility of a period of slower growth because of this legacy of debt. There's also the possibility of faster productivity growth if we succeed in remaking our economies in the way that I was talking about before.
What about the prospect of what I've been hearing some people say is a global financial reset? Can you just take a note off debt? Can you find a way in which to massage the numbers to enable us to overcome what might otherwise be a hurdle in trying to get us back to where we were? assuming that we can pick up the pieces and things do work out, is there a reset that the global economy can agree upon? I'm talking here about the entire globe getting together to decide to do something about this. Economically, is this something that people can think about? Is it something you can model? Is it a possibility? Do you see a global financial reset happening, whatever that means?
I don't think it's possible, number one, because globally we don't seem to be able to agree on anything. This is a Trump administration problem in part, but it's fair to say that views in the United States of China have changed permanently. And even under a Biden administration or whatever, it's going to be hard to get the major economies to agree on a common set of policies. Secondly, the kind of debt reset or debt jubilee that you describe is difficult to do in democracies. In particular, there are holders of that debt as well who will be unhappy if their claims are written down. And third, in an interconnected financial system, the investment funds and banks that hold significant fractions of this debt are going to be deeply managed by that kind of reset. So I think the way debts have typically been dealt with in the past is what we're going to have to do now through a combination of keeping interest rates down, growing our economies, and balancing our budgets once the crisis is past, whenever that is the only road open to us. That's going to be a long, hard slog, but that's what we're in for.
One final question is the currency markets. We have historically used, well, in fact, of course, it was gold originally, and then it was the dollar that became the global reserve currency. Do you see a new reserve currency coming through? Do you think cryptos, for example, could be the answer to have a pan-global currency which everybody accepts? Or do you think we'll go back and just accept the fact that the dollar will ultimately return to its position as the reserve currency of the world?
I don't think cryptos are the wave of the future, frankly. The long sweep of history suggests that currency issuance is the province of governments, and that the world of many private label currencies like we had in the United States in the 19th century is over. The Federal Reserve has reminded us again that if you're going to have a global currency, you need a powerful central bank prepared to do whatever it takes, standing behind it. So I think the world that is coming is one in which the dollar will have rivals, namely the euro and the Chinese renminbi. I've been predicting that for a long time now, and I like to say I'll keep predicting it until I'm right. It hasn't happened yet, but with the European Commission proposal for the issuance of 750 billion euros worth of European Union bonds, with Chinese efforts to internationalize their currency, and with dissatisfaction about how the US government has weaponized the dollar, used the dependence of other countries on the dollar as a way of enforcing US sanctions against Iran, I think that movement will continue. How quickly it unfolds depends on how serious the Europeans are about moving in the direction of fiscal union or fiscal federalism, how successful the Chinese are at building their financial markets, and how reckless or otherwise U.S. financial and foreign policy turns out to be.
Okay, Barry Eichengreen, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much indeed for joining us to talk us through where we are and how things could develop. And of course, much of what we discussed depends very much on how the coronavirus develops. But whichever way you cut it, it certainly seems we've entered a new era of economics. That was Barry Eichengreen, Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you for joining us on this week's IG Markets podcast. For more videos from us here at IGTV, join us on Twitter at IGTV and subscribe to our YouTube channel.